If you've watched very many of my videos covering older games or remakes of them, then you've almost certainly heard my little spiel about how I prefer to get full-fledged sequels and new entries of a great series than remakes or remasters of the originals. Now that's not to say I won't play and enjoy a good remake, I always will, but I'll definitely be more excited for new characters, new areas, and new storylines than old ones. So here's my list of 5 games that I think need sequels right now. The first game that I think needs a sequel, and I think it's fairly obvious, is Sonic Mania. I don't really think Sega was ready for Sonic Mania to be as successful as it was, and may very well have been a little butthurt about it since they've been trying to make the 3D thing work for a very long time with mixed results at best. But Sonic Mania sold extremely well, and while it can't erase a decade of bad and mediocre Sonic games, it did more than its fair share of restoring goodwill among old and new Sonic fans alike. And I think it's fair to assume that a sequel, preferably led by the same team, would go even further. So I think it's time for Sonic Mania 2, but with one stipulation: start on a different level than Green Hill Zone. We all love Green Hill Zone, but start with something else, come on. The next game is a big one for me. While I always knew about the Warhammer 40k universe and I thought it looked really cool, the RTS games just really weren't my style, and I didn't really have much of an entry point into the franchise until Space Marine came out, and it ended up being one hell of an entry point for sure. At first glance, Space Marine kind of looks like a Gears of War clone, and at that time there were a few of those popping up, so I don't blame people for thinking that initially. But the truth is, Space Marine has very little in common with Gears of War once you really get playing it. Other than the fact that it's a third-person shooter with big bulky suits, the game is basically totally different. It rewards aggression instead of hanging back behind cover, and really plays more like a Musou game at times as you plow through hordes of orcs with extremely powerful weapons and gory finishers. The main characters are a little bland and the color palette is a little brown, but towards the last half of the game, the story does heat up quite a bit, and eventually it ends on a cliffhanger, so this game definitely needs a sequel, and the Warhammer series could always use another entry point for more action-adventure oriented gamers like myself, since even to this day there's still hardly any. One is an above-average shooter platformer game for the PS1 published by Capcom. Assuming they still have the rights to it, which I think they do, they should definitely do a sequel. It wasn't particularly popular back in the day, as there were much more noteworthy games on the PS1 at the time, admittedly. But nowadays, among PlayStation and retro enthusiasts, it has garnered a bit of a fan base. It has great action, fun weapons, and an interesting rage mechanic that ties your weapon strength and your health together into one metric, which is pretty unique, and it keeps the HUD very minimal and lets you focus on the action. As if it didn't already justify having a sequel enough, it ends like this.
This will either be my first log or my last. I don't know yet, but I'll have to assume it's my last. After everything, I've destroyed what I believe to be the source of this madness. I doubt the facility will survive the blast. I can only hope that the ship dies with it. My memory is real sketchy, but I'm slowly piecing it back together. Voices keep calling to me. I've got to go find her. Now. John Kane, out.
So I mean, come on, don't you want to know what happens there? I do. Other than a few platforming sections, one pretty much fills your TV with constant shooting, exploding, and enemy death screams all the way to the end. And I think that mid to late 90s action movie tone of it would be kind of refreshing in a way with a modern sequel. Although I'm not sure what they would call it. I guess 2? Either that or 1-2. Or I guess they could just use one of those generic subtitles that everyone uses now. But regardless of what they call it, I think a sequel to 1 would definitely fill a space in the action genre that has been left pretty dormant for way too long, I think. So as long as we're on the topic of PS1 games, I should bring up Fighting Force, the action beat 'em up that supposedly started as Streets of Rage 4, it was dropped, picked back up, and then given the name Fighting Force. The game isn't remembered quite as fondly by most as it is me. Admittedly, it was quite clunky, but I think a real sequel could improve on these things and add up to a fantastic co-op focused experience. And yeah, I know there's technically a game already called Fighting Force 2, but I say ignore that game and try again because it's nothing like the original and it just pretty much blows in its own right. A real Fighting Force sequel that fits with the original would be great, especially with local and online multiplayer baked into it. Call it Fighting Force 3 if you have to, but I don't really care what it's called. As long as it happens, I'm happy. Resogun definitely made its mark on the PS4 as one of the best launch games in console gaming history, and it still holds up really well today. The developers of Super Stardust HD definitely didn't need to prove themselves this much, but they did it anyway. The game is just pure hardcore arcade shooter fun. It goes well beyond being an homage to Defender with this outstanding soundtrack, custom ship creation, and a visual style that's all its own. The particle effects are still just as mesmerizing as they were in 2014. The only flaw with the Resogun is that it's just over too soon, so I think the case for a Resogun sequel pretty much argues itself here. I just want more of this. Well, there you have it. Those are 5 games that I think need sequels right now. And I know there's literally thousands of other games that would totally justify a good sequel, so let me know what games you think deserve sequels and why in the comments below, and we'll keep the conversation going. And I'll probably cover this topic again. But until then, thanks for watching.